Tony has recently retired after 40 years in the aviation industry. He's worked for MMA, Cathay Pacific, Qantas and Virgin Australia. He has a good background on what goes on out there in the aviation world. He's worked in management positions in WA, Northern Territory and South Australia, and he has a keen history in aviation, and particularly aviation in Western Australia. So Tony will be talking about a DC-3 accident in which his father was a crew member. So Tony, over to you.
I should just highlight that my background in airlines is not flying, it was more on the commercial side, so not on pilot. As Brian mentioned, this is just really a bit of a short family story involving aviation and my dad post-war. Interesting story about a ditched DC-3 which was found 61 years later, basically. So my dad, Ray McGrath, joined the RAF RAAF in 1943, just shortly after his 18th birthday, and received his initial RAAF training in Clontarf in Perth at number 5 ITS. I'm not quite sure what ITS stands for, initial induction training, perhaps, I'm not sure. He later trained as a wireless air gunner at the number 1 wireless air gunnery school in Ballarat. And as a wireless air gunner, he served as aircrew with 36 Transport Squadron in Dakota Aircraft. Mostly during that last year or so of the war, he was flying stores and equipment between Northern Australia and New Guinea. And at the end of the war, in fact upon the end of the war, he was involved in carrying a senior Japanese army officer to the Wewak surrender ceremony in New Guinea, where Lieutenant General Adachi surrendered to Major General Robertson. Adachi was the commander of the 18th Imperial Japanese Army. So my dad was involved in some of those transportations. After New Guinea, he was back to mainland Australia, mainly in Townsville and Darwin. 6 months later, in February 46, 6 months after the end of the war, in February 46, the first Australian troops arrived in Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, supporting the US presence there. And this was the first time that Australian troops had been involved in a military occupation of a country defeated in war. There were other forces in the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces as well, besides Australia, that are also from Britain, India and New Zealand. Early in 1947, the British Commonwealth Occupation Force had begun to decline in numbers, and by the end of 48 it was comprised mostly of Australian troops. But at its peak there were around 15,000 Australians in there. The Australian forces remained there until the early 50s, responsible for the Hiroshima prefecture in Japan. So in support of the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, from 1946, the RAF provided regular courier runs from Australia to Japan carrying supplies and equipment, and Dakota aircraft from 36 Squadron were largely operated on these services. My dad crewed these flights as a wireless operator. Just as a point of interest, the RAF RAAF services finished in 47 when Qantas commenced commercial airline services between Australia and Japan. So there's a couple of samples of the routes they used. This first one here was starting in Townsville. They went up via, actually I'm not sure the directionality, which is north or which is south, but one way they went via Dutch New Guinea and the Dutch East Indies and British Northern Borneo, as it was then, Philippines, Okinawa, and then several stops in Japan. Thanks, Brian. And then another one, for example, I got this from his logbook, up again via Dutch East Indies, Philippines, Okinawa and Japan. It may be hard to read, but it's just for illustration purposes. There are a lot of other internal Japanese stops. I only showed 2 or 3 on that map, but there are probably 8 or 10 little places in Japan. That's a bunny hop from one base to another all around Japan during their time up there. On the 5th, now we come to my dad's story, on the 5th of September 46, at 4:45 p.m, RAF Dakota number A65115, or civilian registration Romeo Golf Charlie, took off from Darwin. This aircraft was built in the early 40s in the US, and it was initially assigned to the US Army Air Force, but delivered to the RAF later, and initially assigned, in June 45 was delivered to the RAF, and then assigned initially to 35 Squadron, and later to 36 Squadron. So on this day then, on the 5th of September 46, on this afternoon, my dad crewed this test flight from Darwin. It was after a routine 60-hour maintenance inspection. There were 5 crew members on board altogether. The skipper was a chap called Flight Lieutenant Arnold Lang. And then there were 3 LAC engineer, mechanic, electrician people, Hanson, Bowley and Hardy, plus my father, who again was the radio operator. So there was no second pilot on this flight. There was a shortage of crew in Darwin at that very time, and the aircraft needed to depart for Japan early the next morning, and the skipper made the decision to fly without a second pilot, and off they went. So not long after taking off, the starboard engine appeared to be consuming an abnormally high amount of fuel. So they did a visual inspection, and they could see there was a serious fuel leak. They could see the stuff flowing out. So the skipper turned off the fuel to that engine and feathered it, and soon afterwards it actually burst into flames. So then he deployed the motor or engine fire extinguisher, but apparently it did not work, and at the same time the port engine lost power. Smoke filled the cabin. The distress procedure was carried out. The aircraft prepared to ditch into the open sea. It wasn't that far out of Darwin, and Dad radioed Darwin to let him know. So after impact, the water, it remained floating for a short while, a couple of minutes from memory, from what he used to tell us. And while it's still floating, one of the LAC's, Hanson, was injured. He was lying against the starboard side of the aircraft. Dad helped him and then Harvey get out of the plane. The door had already been opened, and deployed the dinghies. Interestingly, 2 of the 3 dinghies did not inflate. It's later put down to lack of maintenance. There's some talk about privilege of some items from the dinghies as well. So two crew were in one dinghy, and the other 3 were in the water. My dad and 2 other guys, and I'm assuming it's the skipper and one of the other LAC, clung to some floating wreckage in the water. Happily, there were no fatalities. All were injured, some not much. Hanson was the worst of all of them, but for most of them it all involved basically lacerations and fractures. I remember my dad saying that the scariest part after the ditching, the scariest part then was hanging in the water onto a bit of wreckage, bleeding, and he's worried about sharks. It's a big worry of his. But fortunately, they weren't too far from the coast, and a RAF Catalina came out, plus a civilian boat before too long, and rescued all of them. You probably can't read that, but it's just for illustration purposes. There was a comprehensive RAF court of inquiry undertaken. I've actually got a copy of it at home, which my dad got before he passed away. In conjunction with the court of inquiry, they went out to the side of the ditching and couldn't find anything. There's no signs of any wreckage, and they failed to locate the aircraft itself, which I think was at about 21 foot of water, we found out later. So that was back in 1946. So time moved on. My father discharged from the RAAF in 48, joined the WA Police Force, and retired as a police superintendent in 1985. That's him there. And during my childhood years, my father would dine on this story, as were kids. The day Dad ditched the Dakota in Darwin. And of course, as my brother and I listened in awe to him, naturally. In later years, when he retired, he made efforts to try and find out whether the wreckage was ever found. And it wasn't. He tried contacting the Australian War Memorial historians, RAF Museum, and other organisations, but to no avail. Never found while he's alive. Just as an aside, slightly on a tangent now, in the 1980s, he and my mum went to Japan for a holiday. My brother used to live there just almost on impulse, he happened to be in an area where one of the bases was that he flew into in the occupation days. He and my mum just walked up to the gate unannounced and explained, the connection, and said, is there any chance of having a look inside? And surprisingly and endearingly, the Japanese were extremely gracious and absolutely invited them inside, took them into the mess, and the commander came out and had a chat. It was very decent of them, just walking off the street like that. Anyway, so the wreck was never located, and my father passed away in 1996. Okay, so fast forward now another 11 years, so up to 2007 now. It's 2007. I'd been away overseas for a work trip, and so hadn't been in contact with the news. Hadn't quite worked out smartphones and ABC Online in those days. And when I got back, I visited my elderly mum, and she said, I think they found Dad's plane, were the words that she used. I said, oh, okay. So I think she half heard something, and all I knew was it was on the ABC News. It was apparently an item about a Dakota wreck being found off Darwin, and but she couldn't recall any other details. I think she just caught the tail end of it. But thank heavens for the internet. Happily, I found the news item online in the end. And I tracked down the story, and I found the details, and I established who it was that found the aircraft. And there's a chap by the name of Sean Udam, who's in the photo. Sean, he doesn't do it now, but back then he ran a tourist fishing company called Fish Darwin, where he take tourists out on boats to get them to have a fish. And he was telling me, he's a very, very generous and gracious man too, he was telling me that he was, part of his job, he goes out fishing for a living. He found that there was an area that was rich in fishing out from Darwin, where he knew there was no reef. So he thought, I'm going to go and have a look. And he did, and there was the plane. So it was indeed Dad's plane. He told me the rego before I even had a chance to check it. I don't know how he knew. I didn't actually have that part of the conversation, but it had been established that it was Romeo Golf Charlie, which was my dad's plane. And there it was, 61 years to the month after it ditched. It was September 2007. I also spoke to the NT Heritage Council, and they were already in the process of evaluating it as a heritage site, which they did, and it is now entered into the Northern Territory Heritage Register. There's lots of other wreckage sites in Darwin, off Darwin as well, not only planes, but also boats, and not only from the war, but also from Cyclone Tracy, which are registered as heritage sites. So there's a couple of photos from below. These are arranged by the Heritage NT people. That's the port prop, the one that wasn't on fire. This is actually a radio which my dad would have been on, what there was of it. This little document was also produced by Heritage NT, and it shows a plan of the aircraft on the seabed, what there is of it, a list of the individual relics or items, if you like, that could be identified on the plane. Extremely disappointingly, once the aircraft had been registered, most of these items were pilfered off the wreck. Upon the wreck's discovery in 2007, all crew members or immediate family were, except one, were able to be contacted. So they're all still with us except for one. My dad and at least one other person. And now a buoy marks the site of the wreck and as a listed heritage site. So while those items were stolen off the plane, it's pleasing at least that to see a photo of Dad's radio on the front cover. And most importantly and happily, that all 5 crew lived to tell the tale and regale their kids who would listen in or over the kitchen table. That's about it, really. Just a bit of a family story there. And if you are interested in knowing any more about it, if you want to Google Dakota wreck Darwin, it'll come up. In fact, there's even some underwater footage of Sean swimming around the aircraft. Very, very murky. Otherwise, I would have shown it here, but it is pretty murky. And also a copy of that little brochure that I mentioned before. So that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been interesting.